So I want to give an overview of the early 19th century treatise by Daniel Mendoza, the fighting Jew, heavyweight champion of boxing, despite being only 5'7" and around 160 pounds. He was a little guy and an angry guy, known for many street fights and fights in which he did not make a lot of money. He starts by talking about the requisites of a good boxer, and those are strength, art, courage. Those are his three main requisites. Art meaning boxing ability, or having trained in the art or science of boxing. He says strength is the most important one. Unfortunately, the debate is whether strength or art are most important. He says a stronger man who's less trained can still often beat a weaker man who is more trained. He says to get used to moving your legs without any regard for a proper side. So he wants you to be totally ambidextrous, blocking with both hands, punching and countering with both hands, and moving in a balanced way, left or right, forward or backwards, without any favoritism between directions. So there's a lot of mobility. He says it's better to completely avoid strikes so you can land your counter than it is to block them. So he talks about 4 rules. His 4 rules of boxing, I would say, are his main system in terms of how you box. So rule number 1 is look your opponent in the face when you square up to him. He says there are moments where you can drop your eyes to his body if you want to feint a body strike, but even that is dangerous. He says if you're even looking down at his body with your eyes for a moment, you could get hit in the face without seeing it. So you look your opponent in the eyes and obviously read strikes with your peripherals. The next rule is how you parry. So he says you always block his right hand blows with your left hand, with the forearm usually, and his left hand blows with your right arm. So if he's coming on this side with either a straight or round punch, I'm doing this. He says always move your body away and your head. When he describes blocking, he says block your face with one hand high and bar your stomach with your other hand. So you're never going to have 2 down, he says. That's something that only untrained people do, block their stomach with both hands, because obviously they will get hit in the face. On the other side, bar your body with your left forearm, block with your right forearm. But he did give a couple of exceptions to the rule of blocking same side with same side arm. He says if there are opportunities where you can block his left arm with your left arm, which is if your opponent is doing too many fast straight strikes with his left arm. So that's the jab. And that's what I thought as well reading it. I thought that's a little bit tough to block his jab with your right only. So you can block his jab with your with your left arm as well if he's too fast to block with the right. And you return to the body, he says. That's the other circumstance. If you're trying to set up a blow, what he says, to the kidneys, underneath the floating ribs around the sides, or I would think other organs such as the liver, he says you can break the rule and block his left with your left. The rule is don't cross your arms. It's a common rule in lots of martial arts. He says if you do this to try to get some kind of advantage blocking both sides, there is the cross block in more modern boxing as well. It's effective. But he says in those rules, you are allowed to grab. Grappling and throwing is a big part of bare knuckle boxing of that era. He says if someone's doing this, you simply pull down on the top arm, which will trap both arms. Then dropping both his arms with one hand, you can KO him to the face. So how does Daniel Mendoza actually punch? We see a lot of variation in bare knuckle between straight blows and the more modern style of turned over blow. So a fist that goes like this or like this. He doesn't really talk in detail about that, but I would expect you take whatever angle you need to get to whatever target you need. So you strike with the two large knuckles. And he talks about the main targets. So eye is his favorite target. With bare knuckles, you could think of these as trying to poke the guy in the eye. So you don't need to go full power and risk breaking your hand if your targeting is on. So I'm going to try to be actually hitting his eyeball with these knuckles, which he describes as creating a blinding effect, obviously. He says almost as good as the eyes is the middle of the forehead between the eyebrows. He says a punch there will produce a very similar effect of causing this whole area to swell with blood and restrict the opponent's vision. And he also talks about when your opponent can't see for at least a moment, finishing him with powerful strikes to the body, especially under the floating ribs to the kidneys. He says round punches and straight punches don't even bear explanation because everyone knows what those are. Okay? He has his own special type of punch, the chopper, or the Mendoza, he even humbly calls it, which I'll talk about in a moment, which is his own unique type of strike. But he doesn't go into much detail about biomechanics of punching otherwise. So moving on to the rest of the targets. He talks about the temple. He says there's a lot of veins there, and you can produce a stunning effect. So we all know how devastating a blow is to the temple. He talks about the nose bridge. So this is why I think it makes sense to think about being kind of agnostic about whether your hand is up or down. Depending on the angle, this makes a lot of sense. If you want to connect these two knuckles to a nose bridge, having your hand upright would work best. If you want to connect with his eye on this side, maybe turning it over. Whatever you need, whatever angle you need to make that target work. This is more about precision striking to these targets than it is raw KO power, like modern boxing where your hand is covered with a cushion. So, eyes, nose bridge, in between the eyes, temple. He has another one which is behind the left ear. He says this could be deadly, and he cites examples of people who were seriously hurt with a strike like this. And as I mentioned, to the organs underneath the ribs. So last thing I'll share is his specialty strike, the Mendoza. So he says this makes perfect sense when you're blocking on the same side. So if he's throwing a left at me, I block, and he says you shoot your elbow up and you come over his guard with a back fist that uses the same two knuckles. And this can be quite powerful, actually, more powerful than people might expect. So you block there, come over, especially to that nose bridge. He says this blow to the nose bridge, he's split people's noses open with it many a time. So on the other side, it would look like this. He comes on there, block. He says do it when you think the guy is not doing a combo, but he's about to retreat to his guard. You have to use judgment. And this is part of rule number 1, looking at his face to see his intentions. If he's gonna come with a multiple strike combo, might not be the right time to go in for that. I block, I go for it, I get hit, doesn't work. But if he's going for one strike at a time, use the opportunity, come up and over, and finish him like that. Especially considering there was also grappling, grabbing with the forearm, you're blocking. I can see that working quite well, even if you're a shorter guy, hopping up over his guard where he doesn't expect it. So otherwise he talks about 1 or 2 basic principles, mostly how to deal with somebody who's aggressively encroaching on you. The best way to deal with a lot of forward momentum, people who want to close the distance and overwhelm you, is to strike at them, strike and retreat. So he's coming in, you're jabbing and moving back. The other thing he talks about is grappling. He favors a close where you get an underhook and hook this arm. I don't know if you can see, but you go around the person's body and trap their arm like that. He says if you're fast, you can make that work. You block the person's punch. You can also, if he's coming around with a punch there, I've gotten the underhook, he's trying to punch me across. I can block that punch, feed it back to my own arm, lock it up, and then finish him at will like this. He says he's won many a fight with that particular move. He also just talks about basic trips. Sounds like they had judo-style leg trips. And big hip throws, he says. What he calls the, I think he calls it the hip-to-hip or something like that throw. If you're not just sweeping his leg, but if you're getting his entire body over your hip, he says that can be a very deadly strike because you can slam the person directly on their head on the floor. So they clearly had very different rule sets that resembled street fighting, although hits to the groin or even the belt were grounds for an immediate disqualification. So that is in a nutshell the entire system of Daniel Mendoza. He has a section on training and diet, which involves a lot of claret wine and things like that. So I don't think that those would be relevant. I wouldn't take his 1700s advice on diet quite seriously. But otherwise, I think this is a very, very good basic system, and it has those internal principles that make it, I would think, a good system to introduce to new boxers even in the year 2025.